I always believed that in a massive corporation, power and money could bend the truth behind glass doors. But there is one thing harder to kill than a scapegoated employee's reputation: the paper trail. When human resources framed me to save the chief executive's nephew, they thought deleting logs and pushing a neat severance package would be enough. They did not know my habit. I keep records, reference codes, and the very things they thought no one saw. My name is Harper James. I am 39 years old, and I work as the Senior Compliance Records Manager at Meridian Cold Chain Solutions in Columbus, Ohio. My job is not glamorous, but it is the invisible, rigid spine of the modern pharmaceutical industry. I monitor the cold chain records for high-value medical shipments. We are talking about highly volatile vaccines, experimental biologics, and specialized oncology drips that cost more than a luxury car per vial. If a pallet of these drugs gets too warm by even a fraction of a degree for a few minutes, the molecular structure degrades, the medicine becomes useless, or worse, toxic. People could die. Because of that heavy reality, my monitor screen is my entire world, and the data streaming across it is supposed to be absolute law. Meridian was a massive facility. We operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, moving millions of dollars of sensitive cargo across the country. It was a Tuesday night, deep into the final week of the third quarter, which meant the revenue push was frantic. The executive floor was desperate to hit their financial targets to please the board of directors. I was sitting in the glass-walled compliance booth overlooking the loading bays. The deep, rhythmic hum of the massive industrial refrigeration units vibrated through the concrete floorboards, a constant reminder of the fragile climate we maintained. I was running my standard pre-departure data checks on Warehouse 4. That specific zone was our staging area for the most sensitive, highest-tier cargo. As I refreshed the internal monitoring dashboard, something felt fundamentally off. The interface was entirely too clean. Just 20 minutes earlier, I had seen a brief flicker of amber on the interface, a preliminary warning sign of a temperature fluctuation. Now, the status bars were a uniform, serene green across the board. The system looked perfect. I knew better than to trust a sudden, perfect picture. I dug into the raw telemetry, bypassing the user-friendly interface to look at the actual machine code streaming from the sensors. My eyes scanned the lines of data, and my stomach dropped. Within a span of exactly 11 minutes, 3 critical temperature excursion alerts had completely vanished from the internal dashboard. They did not trigger a resolution protocol. They did not flag an error code. They were simply erased from existence. In my line of work, you do not just lose temperature alerts. The tracking software is designed to write every single anomaly to an immutable local cache before syncing up to the main corporate server. If an alert disappears, it means a human hand reached in and choked the system. I picked up my two-way radio and keyed the designated channel for the staging dock. Hold bays 1 and 2. Do not release the reefer trucks. I repeat, dock the manifests immediately. Nothing leaves Warehouse 4. Through the thick glass window of my booth, I saw the dock supervisor on the floor below throw his hands up in the air in sheer frustration. 2 massive refrigerated container trucks were idling, their heavy exhaust pluming into the crisp Ohio night air. Operations was going to have my head for this. We were only a few hours away from the quarterly revenue cutoff. Holding those 2 trucks meant risking millions of dollars in recognized sales for this quarter. But I did not care about the company's financial statements. The data was compromised, and I was the final line of defense. Before I could even finish printing the preliminary holding forms to document my decision, the heavy metal door to the compliance booth swung open. Nolan Ellison walked in. Nolan was 33 years old, fresh into the role of Director of Operations, and he moved with the frictionless, arrogant glide of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. It certainly helped that he was the nephew of our Chief Executive Officer, Grant Ellison. He wore a sharply tailored suit that looked entirely out of place on a concrete warehouse floor, a visual reminder that he belonged to the executive suite, not the working floor. "Harper," Nolan said, leaning casually against the edge of my desk and offering a practiced, disarming smile. "I hear you are trying to give my dock boys a heart attack down there. Let the trucks roll." as UIXS. We are right up against the midnight cutoff. I did not look up from my keyboard. I kept my posture relaxed but firm. I cannot do that. Nolan. Warehouse 4 had 3 significant temperature spikes in the last hour, and the system alerts were wiped from the dashboard. Nolan sighed loudly, rubbing the bridge of his nose as if dealing with me was an immense, exhausting burden. It is just a small system glitch. Harper, you know how it is. The information technology guys have been migrating the backup servers all week. The ambient temperature down there is perfectly fine. Do not make a huge deal out of a phantom error. Just sign off. I turned my chair to face him directly. I kept my voice perfectly level. The trick to surviving in corporate compliance is never letting the executives see you sweat, and never raising your voice to match their manufactured urgency. If it is a phantom error, then the hardware logs will easily back up your claim. I need the raw sensor logs from the past 6 hours. I also need the batch codes for every pallet currently loaded, the seal numbers for the truck doors, and the latest calibration records for the ambient monitors in Zone 4. The charming smile fell off Nolan's face instantly. His jaw tightened, and the friendly facade vanished. You are intentionally bottlenecking a major delivery over bureaucratic paperwork. I am telling you, as the Director of Operations, that the cargo is fine, and I am telling you, as the Senior Compliance Records Manager, that I need the logs. I replied smoothly. Standard operating procedure requires a manual verification if the digital dashboard shows any discrepancies. Right at that tense moment, a young warehouse technician, wearing a thick thermal jacket and carrying a heavy metal clipboard, stepped into the booth to hand me the physical shipping manifests. He looked nervously back and forth between me and the angry Director of Operations. "Is it doing the thing again?" the technician blurted out, clearly unaware of the standoff he had just walked into. Nolan snapped his head toward the kid. "Excuse me?" The technician shrank back, nervously clutching his clipboard to his chest. "I just meant, the manual resets. This is the 3rd week in a row we had to do a manual reset on the Zone 4 sensors right before the shipping cutoff. I thought maintenance fixed the cooling units last month." The silence in the compliance booth became dense and suffocating. Nolan glared at the young technician with a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Then, he quickly smoothed his expression back into a mask of mild annoyance. "Thank you. That will be all. Get back to the floor immediately." The kid scurried out, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just handed me the equivalent of a loaded gun. I turned my attention back to the monitor and stared at the screen. The 3rd week in a row, right before the revenue cutoff, my mind raced through the complex digital architecture of our archiving system. If there were manual resets happening down on the floor, the internal exception reports should still automatically generate an audit trail. But they were gone. They were totally invisible. I quickly pulled up the hidden directory where the raw compliance metadata was temporarily housed before compression. I scanned the code. The exception logs had been modified. This was not a clumsy deletion by a tired, overworked warehouse employee. The internal timestamps were meticulously altered, and the cryptographic checksums had been recalculated to match the new, fake timeline. Someone understood our complex storage protocols perfectly. They knew exactly how to scrub the dirty data while preserving a flawless veneer of valid compliant records. The temporary temperature issue was just the symptom. The disease was intentional. Systematic fraud designed to push bad product out the door. I did not say another word to Nolan. I turned back to my terminal, typed in my secure override credentials, and initiated a hard lock on the entire shipment. The system flashed a bright red warning, generating a federal hold notice that linked directly to the regulatory agencies. I hit print. The heavy industrial printer in the corner hummed to life, churning out the physical documents. "What on earth are you doing?" Nolan demanded, his voice dropping its friendly tone entirely, replacing it with a cold edge. "I am locking the shipment. The procedural hold is officially logged into the permanent system. The trucks do not move a single inch until an independent third-party auditor clears the sensors." I stood up, taking the freshly printed forms from the tray. "If you want to override me, you will have to use your own executive credentials and take full legal responsibility for the compromised cargo." He stared at me, his eyes cold, calculating, and full of silent fury. He did not yell. He did not threaten me directly. He just gave a curt, tight nod, turned on his heel, and walked out of the booth without another word. I gathered my things. My pulse was steady, but I felt a cold knot tightening deep in my stomach. I walked out of the booth and headed down the long, main administrative corridor to file the physical copies at the front security desk. The hallway was quiet, illuminated by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. As I reached the intersection near the main break room, I saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall. It was a woman from Human Resources. She was holding a thick, dark blue folder clutched against her chest. She was just standing there, watching me approach from the shadows. She did not look surprised to see me. In fact, her posture was perfectly still, waiting. It was as if they already knew this exact sequence of events was going to happen tonight, and they were already moving their pieces into place. The summons arrived in my inbox exactly at 7:30 in the morning. It was a sterile, automated calendar invitation requesting my immediate presence on the 9th floor for a mandatory administrative review. The sender was Tessa Reed, the Director of Human Resources. The 9th floor of the Meridian Cold Chain Solutions headquarters was a different world from the humming industrial reality of the warehouse levels. Up there, the carpets were thick and sound-absorbent, swallowing the noise of footsteps. The air conditioning was always set precisely 3 degrees colder than the rest of the building, creating a perpetually crisp, unforgiving environment. It was the executive territory, a place where messy operational problems were sanitized and packaged into neat financial metrics. Tessa Reed was waiting for me inside Conference Room B. The room was enclosed entirely in frosted glass, making it impossible for anyone walking by to see the details of the execution taking place inside, while still maintaining the corporate illusion of transparency. Tessa had a distinct reputation throughout the company. She was notorious for speaking in a voice so incredibly soft and gentle that you found yourself instinctively leaning across the table just to hear her. It was a deliberate psychological tactic. By the time you realized her soothing words were actually locking every professional door behind you, the conversation was already over. She wore a tailored navy suit and offered me a sympathetic, practiced smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. On the polished mahogany table directly in front of her sat a thick, meticulously organized manila folder. It was marked with a row of neon-colored sticky tabs. The staging was immaculate. "Harper, thank you for coming up so promptly," Tessa murmured, folding her hands neatly over the closed folder. "Please, take a seat. We need to have a very difficult conversation regarding the events of last night, and frankly, your overall professional trajectory here at Meridian." I pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my hands resting loosely in my lap. I did not speak. In a hostile human resources meeting, the first person to fill the silence usually loses ground. Tessa sighed, a faint sound of manufactured disappointment, and flipped open the folder. The first page was a printed executive summary. The bold, capitalized headings jumped off the crisp white paper. They were accusing me of unauthorized interference with operational data, creating a hostile work environment, and deliberately disrupting a critical supply chain. "Operations is deeply concerned about your behavior. Harper," Tessa continued, her tone radiating false concern. "Nolan Ellison filed a formal, expedited grievance early this morning. He stated that you aggressively bypassed standard protocol to bottleneck a highly sensitive, multi-million-dollar shipment. He also noted that you acted erratically, making completely baseless accusations against his technical team regarding the sensor dashboard." She did not pause to let me defend myself. She simply slid a stack of freshly printed digital logs across the vast table toward me. "What worries us far more than the blatant insubordination is the severe inconsistency in your actions," Tessa said, tapping a manicured fingernail against the top sheet of paper. "You claimed last night that you were locking the cargo down because the compliance logs had been tampered with. Yet, here we have the electronic confirmations, bearing your exact digital signature. proving that you personally approved those exact disputed shipments over the past several weeks. You cleared the system exceptions yourself. I looked down at the documents. To an untrained executive, they looked utterly flawless. They featured the correct corporate letterhead, the standard structural margins, and my full name typed neatly at the bottom, alongside a complex cryptographic hash that represented my badge approval. They looked like undeniable proof of my own negligence, but they were not looking at an executive. They were looking at a compliance records manager. My brain was permanently wired to see the invisible architecture beneath the ink. I scanned the first page and found the primary structural flaw in less than 10 seconds. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion, matching the cold temperature of the room. "Tessa," I said, pointing at the regulatory citation listed under the justification clause. "The standard operating procedure you are citing here as the legal basis for these approvals is version 4.2. That specific procedural framework expired almost 1 year ago. The compliance department updated our entire system to version 5.0 last November. I would never, under any circumstances, authorize a Tier 1 cold chain release using an outdated procedural template. The system would automatically reject it." Tessa's sympathetic smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter, but she maintained her soft gaze. Before she could attempt to pivot the conversation, my eyes caught the second, far more dangerous error. I pulled the third page from the stack and placed it dead center on the table. Furthermore, this specific authorization carries a timestamp of 2:13 in the morning on a Sunday. My keycard access records and building logs will clearly demonstrate that I have not set foot inside this facility on a weekend in over 8 months. My remote access security token is strictly geofenced and time-locked to my standard weekly shift hours. It is technologically impossible for me to have generated this signature. I leaned forward slightly, holding her gaze. "If you are presenting these as my official approvals, I require the back-end data. I want the revision codes for each individual file. I need the server synchronization logs, and I need the authentication keys that allegedly link these specific weekend timestamps to my Active Directory profile." Tessa did not blink. She did not look down at the glaring impossibilities I had just pointed out on the paper. She simply reached out, pulled the stack of fake logs back toward her, and calmly closed the manila folder. The technical discrepancies did not matter to her in the slightest, because this was never an investigation. She wasn't trying to find the truth. She was executing a predetermined script. "Harper," Tessa said, her voice dropping to a whisper of tragic empathy, seamlessly changing the entire direction of the meeting. "We recognize the immense pressure you have been under lately. Managing the compliance records for Warehouse 4 is an incredibly stressful, demanding position. Sometimes, even the best people burn out. Sometimes, they make critical mistakes under duress and then struggle to process their own actions. We want to avoid a lengthy, painful disciplinary process. We want to preserve dignity for both sides." She pulled a secondary, much thinner envelope from beneath her leather portfolio and placed it carefully on the table. "The company is prepared to offer you a very generous severance package," she explained, her voice as smooth as glass. "This package includes 6 months of your full base salary, extended healthcare benefits through the end of the year, and a completely neutral letter of recommendation. All we require in return is your signature on a standard non-disclosure agreement. And you can walk away from this unfortunate misunderstanding quietly, with your financial security intact." As she pushed the white envelope across the polished wood, the edge of another hidden document peeked out from the pocket of her open portfolio. The text was upside down from my perspective, but my eyes caught the bold black letters at the top right corner. It was a formal notice of temporary suspension. I read the printed date right below the header. The document had been generated and dated 3 days ago. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, though I did not let a single muscle in my face twitch. They had drafted my suspension letter 3 days before the Tuesday night shift even began. They had written my professional death warrant before Nolan Ellison ever walked into my glass booth, before the temperature alerts ever vanished from my screen. The verdict had been finalized before I was ever asked a single question. They thought they could drown me in paper. They thought that by presenting a mountain of forged data and offering a comfortable pile of hush money, I would panic, take the deal, and quietly disappear, taking the blame for their broken, bleeding supply chain. I did not react emotionally. Anger is a predictable variable, and people like Tessa Reed make their living managing predictable variables. I simply reached out, picked up the white severance envelope, and placed it neatly back on top of her manila folder. I will not be signing a resignation, and I will not be signing a non-disclosure agreement today, I stated, my voice sharp and level. I am officially requesting certified copies of this entire file, including the suspension notice currently sitting inside your portfolio. I will sign the procedural receipt acknowledging that this meeting took place and that documents were presented to me, and I will do nothing more. For the very first time since I walked into the room, Tessa's mask slipped. A brief flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed her eyes. The soft, trap-setting voice faltered as she wordlessly slid a standard meeting acknowledgement form across the table. I took my own pen from my pocket, signed my name clearly on the bottom line, gathered the copies she was forced to hand over, and stood up. The air in the room felt thick and suffocating, heavy with the silent declaration of war. I turned my back on the Director of Human Resources and walked out of the glass room. As I stepped into the waiting elevator and watched the metal doors slide shut, cutting off the view of the 9th floor, one thing became absolutely clear. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated framing. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They assumed I was just a quiet employee who only managed the records they gave me. They did not know I kept my own. That evening, the silence of my apartment was the exact environment I needed. I pushed aside the centerpiece on my heavy oak dining table and began to unpack my canvas tote bag. Out came the physical copies Tessa had been forced to hand over during our meeting. Then came my own private arsenal printed work notes, physical confirmation emails I always blind copied to my secure offline drive, weekly meeting schedules, printed document codes, and the monthly archiving receipts. I spread them out across the wood, edge to edge, building a paper mosaic of the past 3 months. In the world of corporate compliance, paranoia is often disguised as thoroughness. Some of my former colleagues used to joke that my analog filing habits were archaic, borderline excessive for a modern digital era. They trusted the cloud servers. I trusted ink. After every single document lockdown cycle, I maintained a strict, unbreakable personal protocol. I would open a hardbound navy blue notebook that I privately referred to as the blue thread. In it, using a fine-point pen, I manually recorded the vital statistics of every finalized file, the specific document identification number, the exact revision code, the precise time of finalization down to the minute, and the name of the individual who requested the final change. The blue thread was my absolute anchor to reality. A digital server can be rewritten by anyone with high enough administrative privileges. But ink on bound paper, resting in my locked desk drawer at home, could not be hacked, altered, or deleted. I opened the blue thread flat on the table and placed Tessa's meticulously forged HR file right next to it. I began the cross-referencing process, moving line by line, column by column. The people who framed me were very good. I had to give them that. The documents they presented had the exact corporate font, the perfectly adjusted structural layout, and the flawless letterhead, but they lacked the obsessive attention to microscopic detail that defined my actual profession. I checked the first suspension-triggering document. My digital signature was there, authorizing a release for a compromised pallet. But when I looked at the alphanumeric string at the very bottom right corner, the illusion shattered entirely. The revision code belonged to a legacy template designed exclusively for ambient temperature storage in Warehouse 1. It was a form that had absolutely no data fields for active cold chain monitoring. I had never, not once in my entire tenure, applied that specific revision code to a shipment originating from Warehouse 4. Whoever forged the document had simply pulled my signature and slapped it onto the first generic release form they could find in the Active Directory, completely unaware of the strict zoning codes. I moved to the next layer of the trap, the timestamps. I pulled up my printed badge logs. which I had requested from the ground floor security guard under the guise of an audit verification weeks ago. I lined up the times my physical badge swiped into the Meridian building against the timestamps on the digital signatures Tessa claimed were mine. The pattern was glaringly obvious. Every single suspicious approval, every clearance of a critical temperature excursion, fell squarely into blocks of time where I was nowhere near the corporate campus. One signature was logged at 3:45 in the morning on a Saturday. Another was recorded at 11:30 at night on a Tuesday when I was officially on paid time off. My physical access card was miles away, resting in my purse, yet my digital ghost was apparently working overtime to push compromised pharmaceuticals out the door. My mind shifted from defensive verification to offensive construction. I needed to understand the scope of the rot. I dug into a thick stack of offline email backups. A few weeks prior, I had flagged a minor discrepancy in the handling times. I found the email thread where Nolan Ellison had replied to the entire logistics management team. His words were permanently etched in the hard copy. "We need to keep the supply chain moving. Do not overreact to short-term excursions. The product is more resilient than the conservative guidelines suggest." That single paragraph was a smoking gun of intent. It proved conclusively that the new director of operations was not only aware of the cooling issues in the staging bays, but was actively attempting to normalize them. He was creating a culture of negligence from the top down to protect his quarterly numbers. But Nolan was not a systems architect. He did not have the technical finesse to cryptographically alter compliance logs. Someone else was doing the digital cleanup. I turned my attention to the access registry logs I had pulled right before I locked the system down the previous night. I started mapping the erased temperature alerts against the system login locations. A distinct, rhythmic pulse emerged from the raw data. First, a temperature exception would occur in the warehouse. Then, usually within a window of 2 to 4 hours, the main database would register a modification. The critical piece of the puzzle was the origin of those modifications. Every single data alteration originated from an Internet Protocol address block assigned specifically to the executive suite on the 9th floor. I did not have the high-level security clearance to trace the address down to a specific terminal or a specific user. I did not need to. The overarching picture was completely clear. I was looking at a highly coordinated, multi-week operation. The operations floor was pushing compromised products to meet revenue targets, and someone on the executive level was silently reaching into the servers to erase the evidence, using my login credentials as a convenient, disposable shield. When the cooling issues became too frequent to hide, or when an external audit loomed too close, they needed a fall guy. They chose the compliance manager. At that moment, the temptation to pick up my phone was incredibly strong. I had friends in the quality assurance department. I had reliable contacts in regional shipping who might know something, but I forced my hand away from the device. Meridian's internal communication networks, their phones, their messaging clients, all of it belonged to the same compromised system that was currently framing me. Trusting anyone inside that building was a tactical error I could not afford to make. Instead, I cleared a large section of the living room wall. I took a roll of blue painter's tape and a stack of blank index cards. I began to construct a physical timeline, left to right, dates, times, locations, individuals. I pinned the forged documents next to the corresponding entries from the blue thread. I marked the executive Internet Protocol pings with a thick red marker. I stepped back and looked at the wall. The chaos and shock of the morning had crystallized into a sharp, undeniable sequence of corporate fraud. I was entirely alone, locked out of my own data, and facing the combined weight of the executive board and human resources. But as I looked at my handwritten ledger and the strings connecting the lies, a cold, steady calm washed over me. They thought they had buried me under a mountain of digital fabrications. They thought the truth was whatever they typed into the system. They did not realize I had the one thing that could not be deleted, altered, or silenced. The records do not know how to lie, and I was going to make the executives read every single word they tried to erase. The next morning, I did not log into the corporate portal. I picked up my personal phone and called Sabrina Vale. Sabrina was a partner at a downtown litigation firm, a woman who had built a formidable career shielding whistleblowers from the crushing weight of corporate retaliation. She specialized in records fraud within heavily regulated sectors. I did not give her a dramatic narrative. I gave her the anatomy of a crime. We met in her office, a space devoid of the plush, distracting luxury of Meridian's executive suites. It was functional, lined with dense legal volumes and banker boxes. I laid out the timeline I had built on my living room wall. "They are moving fast," Sabrina noted, her eyes scanning the badge swipe discrepancies and the mismatched revision codes. "But they are arrogant. That is their vulnerability. We need to freeze the battlefield right now." Under Sabrina's strict direction, my first move was surgical. We drafted a formal preservation hold, commonly known as a litigation hold, and served it directly to Meridian's general counsel. It legally bound the company to halt any automated or manual deletion of server data, local hard drives, security camera footage, and email archives. Destroying anything after receiving that notice would instantly escalate their exposure from civil negligence to criminal spoliation of evidence. Simultaneously, we bypassed the internal corporate structure entirely. I filed formal, expedited complaints with the Federal Transportation Oversight Agency and the State Pharmaceutical Licensing Board. The complaints were entirely stripped of emotion. I did not write about feeling betrayed or targeted. I submitted a meticulously curated packet of undeniable metrics. I provided the specific document identification numbers, the glaring revision discrepancies, my physical badge entry logs mapped against the forged digital timestamps, the exact names of the biological shipments, the registration numbers of the refrigerated trucks, and the printed copies of the executive emails demanding accelerated departure times despite the hardware warnings. The paperwork was a heavily armored tank rolling straight toward their glass house. The reaction from the corporate entity was almost violently immediate. Exactly 3 hours after the General Counsel confirmed receipt of the preservation hold, an automated calendar notification popped up on my personal mobile device. It was an urgent directive from the Information Technology Department. The subject line read, "Mandatory hardware recall for routine security maintenance." I was instructed to surrender my company-issued laptop to the ground floor technical support desk by 2 o'clock that afternoon. The timing was so transparent, it was almost insulting. They needed to scrub the local machine before external regulators could secure a warrant to clone it. I walked into the lobby precisely at 1:55 in the afternoon. The main technical support desk was usually chaotic, but today it was strangely quiet. A young technician named Owen Pike was waiting for me. He looked nervous, his eyes darting toward the security cameras mounted in the corners of the ceiling. I placed the silver laptop on the counter. I did not say a word. Owen pulled a barcode scanner from his belt and logged the serial number. As he leaned in to attach the diagnostic cable, he dropped his voice to a barely audible whisper, ensuring his mouth was shielded from the overhead camera angle by the open screen. "They told me to image the hard drive first," Owen whispered, his hands trembling slightly as he typed. "But then my manager gave me a direct verbal order to execute a deep clean protocol immediately after. I am supposed to wipe all the temporary background files, the local synchronization history, and the offline cache. They said it was standard procedure for a departing employee. But you are not officially terminated, are you?" My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained perfectly impassive. The system was trying to eat its own tracks. "Thank you, Owen," I said softly. I placed my hands flat on the counter. "I need you to generate a comprehensive, itemized chain of custody receipt. I want the exact time of surrender printed. I want the current battery level, the physical condition of the casing, and a written confirmation that the machine was functional at the exact moment I handed it over to you. I will not leave this desk until I have a physical copy signed by you." Owen nodded quickly, clearly relieved to have a strict procedural instruction to follow. He printed the receipt, signed it, and handed it to me. I walked out of the building and immediately dialed Sabrina from my car. "They are actively attempting to scrub the local synchronization cache on my machine," I told her, putting the vehicle in gear. I have a witness in the technology department who just confirmed a verbal order to destroy temporary files under the guise of routine maintenance. Document the exact time and location of that conversation, Sabrina ordered, her voice tightening with predatory focus. They just crossed the line from defensive posturing to active obstruction. Let them wipe it. The federal investigators will pull the server-side deletion logs, and it will prove intentional destruction of evidence occurring hours after a litigation hold was served. They are handing us the rope. The evening settled in, heavy and thick with the impending storm. At 8:15 that night, my personal phone rang. The screen displayed a blocked caller identification. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, hitting the record button on a secondary digital audio device sitting on my coffee table. In Ohio, only one party needs to consent to record a conversation, and I was giving my consent. "Hello," I said. "Harper, it is Tessa." The voice came through the speaker. All the cold, sterile authority from the 9th floor conference room was completely gone. Her voice was remarkably soft, carrying a manufactured warmth that set my teeth on edge. It was the voice of a negotiator who realized they were holding a losing hand. "I am calling outside of official channels because I really want to help you," Tessa murmured. "I spoke with the executive board this afternoon. We feel that yesterday's meeting escalated unnecessarily. We are willing to increase the severance compensation substantially. We can offer 12 months of full salary, plus a guaranteed performance bonus payout, and we can vest your restricted stock options early. It is a very generous package. Harper, we just need you to rescind the external notices and sign the non-disclosure agreement. There is absolutely no reason to turn an internal procedural misunderstanding into a messy public legal battle." I listened to the silence humming on the line. The offer was easily worth mid-6 figures. To someone else, it might have been a lifeline. To me, it was a glaring spotlight shining directly on their panic. If they genuinely believed their forged records were bulletproof, they would have fired me for cause immediately and let me flail in the wind. The fact that the director of human resources was calling me from a blocked number after 8 o'clock at night, throwing hundreds of thousands of dollars at me to drop the external complaints, meant one absolute truth. "I have advised my legal counsel of all communications, Tessa," I said, keeping my tone perfectly flat, completely devoid of the anger she was likely expecting. "Any further settlement offers must be directed to Sabrina Vale in writing. Do not call my personal number again." I disconnected the call before she could utter another syllable. I sat alone in my living room, looking at the complex web of evidence taped to my wall. Tessa's late-night desperation confirmed everything. They were not afraid of a disgruntled employee seeking revenge. They were terrified because they knew there was a trail of digital breadcrumbs they had not managed to sweep away yet, and I had just given the map to the federal government. There was absolutely no turning back now. The walls of their sterile executive suite were about to crack. The silence of my suspension was supposed to break me. Instead, it gave me the unbroken focus I needed to watch the cracks form in their foundation. The first fracture appeared 48 hours after I handed over my company laptop. My personal phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. It was a message on an encrypted application I rarely used, sent from a number I recognized immediately. Elise Wren was a senior transport coordinator who sat 2 desks down from my old booth. She was a single mother of 2. Someone who never engaged in office politics because she could not afford to lose her medical benefits. The message contained no text, only a single, high-resolution image. It was a photograph taken of a computer monitor in the logistics bay. I zoomed in on the glowing pixels. The screen displayed the internal dispatch ledger from the previous night. 2 major shipments of raw biological materials were highlighted in yellow, bearing the stark red tag indicating a temperature exception hold. That was the automated safety protocol working exactly as designed. But right beneath those entries, logged exactly 12 minutes later, the status had been manually overridden. The red tags were gone, replaced by the green release authorization. It was not the override itself that made my breath catch. It was the user identification string attached to the command. Standard procedure dictated that only a certified warehouse manager could authorize a release after a physical inspection. But the alphanumeric code next to the green tag did not belong to logistics. It read as a temporary administrative account generated by human resources. The justification code entered next to it was for emergency compliance support. Human resources did not do emergency compliance support. They did not even have the foundational security clearance to access the temperature interface, let alone override a federal biohazard hold. Tessa Reed's department had quietly minted a skeleton key to bypass the warehouse managers entirely, before I could fully process the weight of Elise's photograph. A second message arrived through a standard text. This one was from one of the junior floor workers, who had been working the loading dock on the night of my confrontation with operations. I am so sorry. Harper, the message read. They called me into the 9th floor yesterday. Tessa had a printed statement already sitting on the table. It said you were screaming at the drivers and that you locked the system out of spite. I told them that was not what happened. They told me I just needed to sign it for the investigation flow, or I would be marked as uncooperative and put on unpaid leave. I have a baby on the way. I signed it. I feel sick about it. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone. The anger I felt was not directed at the young man. He was just collateral damage, a pawn squeezed by a machine that had all the leverage. My anger was reserved entirely for the people operating the machine. They were actively manufacturing witnesses. I needed to get out of my apartment. The air was becoming too thick with the weight of the conspiracy. I drove to a small, independent coffee shop located exactly 2 blocks from the Meridian campus. It was a neutral zone, where mid-level employees usually went to escape the corporate cafeteria. I ordered a black coffee and sat in a corner booth, facing the door. 10 minutes later, the bell above the entrance chimed, and Nolan Ellison walked in. He was not there by accident. He did not even bother looking at the menu board. He spotted me immediately, pasted a warm, entirely fabricated smile on his face, and walked straight over to my table. He wore a casually expensive gray sweater, projecting the image of a relaxed, reasonable leader. "Harper," Nolan said, his voice dripping with synthetic relief. "It is so good to see you. Do you mind if I sit for a minute?" "It is a free country, Nolan," I replied, keeping my hands resting loosely on the table, nowhere near my coffee cup. I did not want him to see even a millimeter of tremor in my fingers. He slid into the booth opposite me. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, trying to create an atmosphere of intimate camaraderie. "Look, I know things got incredibly heated the other night," Nolan began, his tone soft and conciliatory. "Emotions were running high. The end of the quarter makes everyone crazy. I want you to know that I do not hold any grudges. We are all just trying to do our jobs." I looked at him, studying the subtle twitch at the corner of his left eye. He was playing a role, but the script was unfamiliar to him. He was used to giving orders, not managing fallout. "What do you want, Nolan?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of inflection. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "I just think we need to be smart about this, both of us. The company is a family. Harper. Sometimes families fight, but they figure it out internally. We should protect the company before the outside makes things worse. Once the federal regulators get deeply involved, nobody wins. They will tear the entire operations department apart, and your professional reputation will be dragged through the mud right along with us. We can still fix this quietly. Protect the company before the outside makes things worse." The sentence was a perfectly constructed trap. It sounded like an appeal to loyalty, but it was actually a desperate plea for containment. He was not interested in finding the truth. He was entirely focused on stopping the hemorrhage of evidence. "My reputation is documented in ink. Nolan," I said evenly. "I am very comfortable letting the outside regulators read those documents. If the operations department has nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." Nolan stared at me, the friendly facade finally cracking, revealing the cold, calculating panic underneath. He slowly stood up from the booth. "You are making a massive mistake. Harper, you think you are the smartest person in the room. You are not." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, the bell chiming a sharp, dissonant note in his wake. I drove back to my apartment, my mind racing. Nolan's desperation meant they were running out of time to sanitize the system. I needed to look deeper into the structural mechanics of their cover-up. I went back to the physical files I had hoarded over the past year. I pulled out a stack of printed budget reconciliation reports from the second quarter. At the time, I had kept them because I noticed a discrepancy in the facility maintenance allocations, something I had planned to bring up in a routine audit. I cross-referenced the maintenance budget against my handwritten blue thread log, specifically looking at the dates when the warehouse temperature sensors had supposedly malfunctioned. A distinct, terrifying pattern emerged from the paper. Exactly 2 months ago, the internal warehouse security cameras had gone offline for an entire weekend due to a scheduled network maintenance interruption. It was the exact same weekend my forged digital signature had been used to release a compromised shipment of high-tier oncology medications. But that was not the anomaly. The anomaly was the emergency payment processed the very next morning. The company had issued an expedited, high-priority wire transfer to a vendor listed as North Vantage Consulting. The invoice description read, as optimization services for cold chain environmental controls. The payment was for a staggering $85,000. I opened my personal laptop and accessed the State Business Registry database. I typed in the name of the consulting firm. The search results loaded instantly. North Vantage Consulting was a registered limited liability company, formed only 8 months prior, but it was the registered business address that made my blood run cold. It was not a corporate office park or an industrial engineering firm. The address belonged to a commercial strip mall in a quiet residential suburb, specifically corresponding to a short-term mailbox rental suite. There was no team of environmental engineers. There was no optimization service. It was a ghost entity. I sat back in my chair, the complete, horrifying architecture of the scheme finally locking into place in my mind. This was never just a case of an arrogant operations director pushing shipments out the door to meet a quarterly quota, with human resources stepping in to clean up the mess. It was a fully integrated, systemic harvesting operation. Someone at the executive level was managing the fraudulent testimonies to isolate anyone who asked questions. Someone was actively altering the compliance logs to bypass federal safety regulations. Someone was deliberately blinding the security cameras to allow unimpeded physical access to the staging bays. And someone had set up a phantom contracting company to siphon the corporate funds completely off the books, getting paid massive sums of money to fix the very problems they were intentionally creating. They had built a perfect, self-sustaining loop of fraud and theft. I was just the unfortunate person standing directly in the middle of their track, holding the only set of real records. They thought they could run me over. They were about to find out that I had built a wall of paper they could never break through. My first meeting with federal investigator Lena Rowe took place in a sterile conference room at the Regional Regulatory Office. I did not sit down and tell her a tragic story about a wronged employee. Tears and frustration hold absolutely no weight in a federal inquiry. Instead, I walked up to the large whiteboard spanning the far wall and began to draw a schematic. I mapped out the timeline of events, the specific documents involved, the logged user access points, the unauthorized data modifications, and the severe legal liabilities attached to each compromised pharmaceutical shipment. Lena Rowe sat quietly, her sharp eyes tracking my every movement. I opened my tote bag and produced the physical backbone of my argument. I explained the concept of the blue thread. I detailed how, for months, I had maintained a personal, analog ledger. I recorded every document identification number, the exact revision path, and the cryptographic checksum receipts for every finalized file. It was a manual redundancy that made digital forgery virtually impossible to conceal. Lena leaned forward, her interest visibly peaking as I laid out the forged approvals human resources had presented to me. She immediately spotted the microscopic detail I had documented. The fabricated logs were not just generic templates. They had perfectly replicated the unique template fingerprint embedded in my master files. That meant whoever forged the approvals did not just pull a blank form from the corporate intranet. They had deep, unauthorized administrative access to my secure digital workspace. The tension of the investigation bled into the physical world later that afternoon. I was walking to my car in the grocery store parking lot when a dark sedan pulled into the empty space directly in front of me, blocking my path. Nolan Ellison stepped out. He did not bother with the friendly facade this time. His face was drawn, his posture rigid with barely suppressed panic. "You think you have this all figured out," Nolan said, his voice tight and hostile. "But there will be an explanation for that blue thread game of yours soon enough. You cannot fight the entire corporate structure. Harper." I froze, my hand hovering over the handle of my car door. I stared at him, my mind processing the magnitude of his mistake. I had never spoken the words blue thread to a single soul inside Meridian. The only people on Earth who knew the name of my personal ledger were Sabrina Vale and investigator Lena Rowe, and I had only mentioned it to them behind closed, secure doors. Nolan had just handed me a live grenade. His slip of the tongue meant one of two things. Either the corporate defense team had an illegal wiretap or a leak inside the Federal Regulatory Office, or Nolan himself had directly accessed my highly restricted investigation file. I did not give him the satisfaction of a response. I got into my car, locked the doors, and drove straight to Sabrina's office to report the encounter. By the end of the day, Lena Rowe's team had secured a massive victory. They subpoenaed the localized network logs from the corporate server. The data confirmed my theory. Every single high-risk data modification had been routed through an executive terminal. The terminal had been temporarily assigned a master access key registered under Nolan's name. The digital fingerprints were all over the weapon. However, Lena refused to close the net just yet. She called me that evening to explain her hesitation. Nolan was arrogant, but he was not the system architect. Lena suspected a much larger gear turning behind the scenes. Someone with immense influence had to authorize the structural changes that turned the Human Resources Department from a standard administrative body into an active, weaponized shield for the operations team. The corporate response shifted gears entirely the following Monday. The board of directors abruptly announced the formation of an independent review committee. It took me exactly 5 minutes of reading their mandate to realize the entire committee was a meticulously designed sham. Their investigative scope was intentionally narrow, designed specifically to gather all the blame and drop it squarely onto the shoulders of a few mid-level logistics managers, completely insulating the executive suite from any real accountability. Then, the ultimate architect stepped out of the shadows. Chief Executive Officer Grant Ellison requested a private, off-the-record meeting. We met in a neutral, upscale hotel suite downtown. Grant did not yell. He did not threaten me. He operated with the smooth, terrifying calm of a man who believed every problem in the world had a price tag. He slid a single piece of heavy cardstock across the glass table. It was a comprehensive settlement offer. He proposed to entirely erase my disciplinary record, provide 2 full years of back pay and severance, and draft a glowing letter of recommendation signed by the board itself. The only condition was that I immediately withdraw my federal complaints and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. "This is how the game is played," Harper, Sabrina told me later, reviewing the document in her office. "It is a classic containment strategy. When they realize they cannot destroy the evidence, they try to buy the silence to prevent a public record. It means we are hitting bone." The very next day, a completely unexpected variable blew their containment strategy wide open. Sabrina received a leaked inquiry from the primary cargo insurance underwriter. The insurance company was demanding a formal explanation for a massive, uncharacteristic spike in product replacement claims. These claims spiked precisely during the exact same financial quarter where Nolan had been heavily promoting his flawless, high-volume delivery metrics. The implication was staggering. Meridian had not just been shipping compromised drugs and hoping for the best. They had actively pushed the high-risk cargo out the door to artificially inflate their recognized revenue for the quarter. Then, they quietly filed insurance claims to replace the damaged goods after the fact, effectively using my compliance department as a smokescreen to maintain a fraudulent financial surface. The walls began to close in, and the rats immediately started looking for a way off the ship. Tessa Reed called Sabrina's office directly. Her soft, manipulative tone was entirely gone, replaced by frantic backpedaling. She officially blamed the entire suspension on a rushed internal investigation, subtly implying that operations had forced her hand. I knew exactly what she was doing. Human Resources was preparing to sever ties with Nolan to save their own careers. Simultaneously, a senior board member named Victor Sloan began aggressively pushing the review committee to conclude their findings by the end of the week. Victor's sudden, desperate urgency struck me as highly suspicious. I dug into his background and found a deep, decades-long financial tie to the Ellison family estate. He was not protecting the company. He was protecting Grant. I sat in Sabrina's office, looking at the shifting board. The corporate machine was terrified, but instead of surrendering, they were simply rearranging the pieces. They were sharpening their knives, fully prepared to sacrifice the small players to ensure the Kings remained completely untouchable. The forensic accounting results came back on a Tuesday afternoon. Sabrina spread the dense financial flowcharts across her heavy mahogany desk. We were no longer looking at a simple case of a fragile supply chain being mismanaged by an arrogant director. We were looking at a highly sophisticated financial artery designed to bleed the company from the inside out. The federal investigators had subpoenaed the banking records for North Vantage Consulting. The entity was an absolute ghost. They owned 0 refrigerated trucks. They employed 0 environmental engineers. They did not even maintain an active commercial utility account. Their entire corporate existence consisted of a registered agent and a commercial bank account located in a strip mall. Yet, over the past 9 months, Meridian had paid them nearly $750,000. Every single invoice from North Vantage was categorized under the exact same vague billing code, Emergency Temperature Remediation Services. "Look at the routing numbers," Sabrina instructed, tracing a red pen along the printed flowchart. "The money does not stay with North Vantage." Within 48 hours of Meridian paying the invoice, exactly 80% of those funds are wired out to 2 intermediary holding companies registered in Delaware. I followed the red line across the paper. "And where do the holding companies send it?" "Back to Meridian," Sabrina said softly, leaning back in her leather chair. "Specifically, it gets routed directly into the executive bonus pool for the operations department, coded as an internal performance consulting dividend." The sheer audacity of the architecture took my breath away. It was a perfectly enclosed loop of dirty money. The operations team was not just carelessly allowing the temperature sensors to fail to meet their volume quotas. They were intentionally letting the systems crash. When the alarms triggered, they hired their own phantom contractor to allegedly fix the problem. Meridian paid the massive, inflated invoices. The money washed through the Delaware shell companies, and then landed right back in Nolan's pocket as a performance bonus for keeping the supply chain moving during a manufactured crisis. They were weaponizing the compliance failures to fund their own executive bonuses. At that exact moment, the final piece of their targeting strategy clicked into place in my mind. For weeks, I had wondered why they went to such extreme, convoluted lengths to frame me specifically. Why not just fire me quietly and hire a more compliant manager? Because a new hire would have triggered an automatic external audit of the department's transition. My position was the ultimate bottleneck. I was the gatekeeper of the archival snapshots. If I had simply kept my mouth shut, if I had blindly accepted the forged revision codes and signed off on the compromised shipments, the entire chain of fake paperwork would have sailed right through the third quarter audit. I was not just an obstacle to their shipping schedule. I was the load-bearing wall holding up their entire embezzlement scheme. My silence was the only thing keeping them out of federal prison. The investigative momentum accelerated later that evening. I received an encrypted message on my personal device. It was Owen from the technology support desk. He was terrified, but his conscience was apparently heavier than his fear of human resources. I pulled the administrative query logs before they locked me out of the main server. Owen's message read, "Exactly 4 hours before they scheduled your laptop for the mandatory security recall, a deep-level deletion command was executed on the network. It was designed to permanently erase the local audit trails. The command originated from a special administrative account belonging to Tessa Reed. Tessa had not just drafted a premature suspension letter. She had actively launched a digital incendiary device into the server to burn the evidence before the regulators could issue a preservation hold. She was fully complicit in the destruction of federal records. As I was documenting Owen's message for Sabrina, my phone rang. It was Elise Wren. Her voice was hushed, carrying the distinct echo of the warehouse locker room. "I have been thinking about the nights you asked about," Elise said quickly. "The nights the temperature alarms vanished. I checked the manual rotation schedules. Every single time Nolan came down to the floor past midnight, a manual verification completed form appeared in the system by 6 in the morning. But I asked the entire night shift crew. None of the floor managers ever signed those forms. Nobody even saw the cargo get inspected." Nolan was acting as his own inspector. He was physically going down to the floor, ensuring the compromised product was loaded onto the trucks, and then relying on Tessa's department to digitally forge the safety verifications before the morning shift arrived. I delivered all of this directly to Lena Rowe the next morning. The atmosphere in the federal field office had fundamentally changed. They were no longer treating me like a standard whistleblower in a wrongful termination dispute. Lena sat at the head of the long conference table, organizing the new financial flowcharts alongside my physical documentation. "We are officially changing the classification of this inquiry," Lena announced, her voice carrying the heavy, authoritative weight of the federal government. "This is no longer a corporate retaliation case. We are upgrading the scope to intentional records fraud, active obstruction of evidence preservation, and the systemic falsification of operational financial reports. We are preparing to draft criminal indictments." The net was finally closing, but my mind was stuck on the anomaly of Victor Sloan. Why was a senior, incredibly wealthy board member risking his own legacy to aggressively force the review committee to close the investigation so quickly? If Nolan and Tessa were acting alone, the board would naturally want to cut them loose and cooperate with the authorities to save the company's stock price. I left the federal office and spent the next 6 hours diving into archival corporate registries, financial filings, and business news databases spanning the last 3 decades. I was looking for the invisible thread connecting the 9th floor to the boardroom. I found it buried in a digitized trade magazine article from 25 years ago. Before Grant Ellison became the chief executive officer of Meridian, he was a struggling regional logistics manager at a completely different firm. He was failing. He was on the verge of being pushed out of the industry entirely. Then, a senior executive stepped in, personally sponsored him, shielded him from the fallout of a massive operational failure, and elevated him to the corporate suite. That executive was Victor Sloan. Sloan was not just a random board member pushing for a quick resolution to save the quarterly dividend. He was Grant Ellison's original corporate godfather. The financial architecture of North Vantage Consulting was too sophisticated, too perfectly insulated, for a 33-year-old operational director like Nolan to invent on his own. Nolan was just the crude instrument moving the boxes on the floor. The realization was cold and absolute. The hand guiding this operation did not just belong to human resources or operations. It reached all the way to the absolute ceiling of the corporation. Victor Sloan was trying to crush the investigation because the dirty money was not just flowing to Nolan. It was flowing upward. They were not preparing to sacrifice the small players to save the big ones. The big ones had been running the entire board from the very beginning. The expanded internal hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the grand boardroom on the top floor of the Meridian building. The corporate communications team had meticulously framed the event in their internal emails. They called it a routine clarification of recent operational misunderstandings, a collaborative effort to ensure all departments were aligned. But the physical setup of the room told a completely different story. 3 senior corporate litigators from an outside defense firm sat lined up on the left side of the massive, polished oak table. 2 highly influential board members sat at the head of the room, their faces arranged in masks of solemn neutrality. In the far back corner, intentionally separated from the corporate structure, sat federal investigator Lena Rowe, observing everything in total silence. I sat on the right side of the table, with my attorney Sabrina Vale right beside me. The air conditioning was running high, making the massive room feel like a meat locker. The company struck first, and they struck with the absolute heaviest weapon in their legal arsenal, their lead counsel. A man named Marcus Thorne did not begin by addressing the temperature logs or the missing sensor data. He went straight for my character. The executive board takes compliance incredibly seriously, Thorne began, his voice projecting easily across the vast room. However, after a thorough preliminary review, we have uncovered a deeply troubling pattern of behavior from Ms. James. The evidence suggests that we are not dealing with a legitimate whistleblower. We are dealing with a deeply distressed employee who recently faced a severe negative performance evaluation. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the cold air. Upon realizing her employment was in jeopardy, Ms. James initiated a massive, unauthorized download of confidential proprietary data. Thorne continued, sliding a thick stack of printed network access logs across the table. She systematically copied thousands of internal files to a personal, unsecured drive. She then weaponized this stolen data to fabricate a wild conspiracy theory, a desperate act of retaliation designed to punish the operations team for her own professional shortcomings. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I forced my breathing to remain slow and even. It was a brilliant, vicious narrative. If they could convince the room that I was simply a bitter, failing employee out for revenge, the actual data I held would be tainted forever. Before I could respond, Thorne delivered the gut punch. We also have a sworn affidavit from an anonymous colleague within the compliance division, Thorne stated, holding up a single, notarized sheet of paper. This individual testified that 2 weeks ago, following a minor disagreement over scheduling, Ms. James became highly erratic. The witness states, and I quote, "She threatened to drag the entire corporate system down and burn it to the ground if no one listened to her demands." The room completely destabilized. The two board members shifted uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs, exchanging alarmed glances. Even Lena Rowe raised an eyebrow, her pen pausing over her notepad. The psychological pressure in the room was immense, designed to crush me into an emotional outburst that would only validate their anonymous witness. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at the lawyer. I simply unclasped my leather portfolio and pulled out 3 sheets of paper. I respectfully request that the board review my actual, documented employment history, rather than the fictionalized version, Mr. Thorne just presented, I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotional tremor. I slid the first document across the polished oak. This is my official quarterly performance evaluation, finalized exactly 1 month ago by the Director of Human Resources. My overall rating is a perfect 5 out of 5. In the section regarding departmental collaboration, I am marked as exceeding expectations. I slid the second document forward. This is an internal memorandum from Nolan Ellison, sent directly to my inbox exactly 6 weeks ago. In it, he specifically praises my uncompromising dedication to compliance, noting that my rigorous filing system saved the company hundreds of thousands of dollars during the last state inspection. Why would the director of operations send a glowing commendation to an employee who was allegedly failing and acting erratically? Thorne's jaw tightened. He tried to interrupt, but Sabrina raised her hand sharply, cutting him off. And finally, I said, placing the third document in the center of the table, this is the system architecture protocol for the compliance department. It explicitly mandates that the senior records manager must create localized, encrypted backups of all finalized reports at the end of every operational month. I did not steal confidential data. I executed my legally mandated job description to the absolute letter. The only people breaking protocol are the ones trying to erase those backups. The narrative of the disgruntled, failing employee shattered right there on the table. But we were not done. Sabrina signaled the administrative assistant waiting by the heavy double doors. Owen Pike walked into the boardroom. The young technology support worker looked pale, his hands trembling slightly as he took a seat at the end of the table. He was terrified of the executive staring him down, but he had reached his breaking point. "Mr. Pike," Sabrina said gently, "could you please tell the board exactly what you were ordered to do when Ms. James surrendered her laptop?" Owen swallowed hard, avoiding the glaring eyes of the corporate litigators. "I was instructed to create a standard digital image of the hard drive, but immediately after that, my direct supervisor gave me a verbal order to execute a localized wipe command. I was told to permanently delete all temporary files, the synchronization history, and the audit logs from the device." "Did your supervisor explain why this was necessary?" Sabrina asked. "He told me the directive came straight from the 9th floor," Owen answered, his voice gaining a fraction of confidence. "He said human resources needed the machine completely sanitized before the end of the day." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. Before the defense lawyers could attempt to cross-examine the frightened technician, Elise Wren was called into the room. The senior transport coordinator sat down, her posture rigid. She did not look at the board members. She looked directly at me. "Ms. Wren," Sabrina prompted, "can you explain the verification process you experienced regarding the warehouse temperature logs?" "There was no verification process," Elise stated flatly. "When the alarms went off, we were told to stand down. The next morning, Human Resources would email us pre-written confirmation statements. The documents stated that we had personally inspected the cargo and found it safe." "Did you inspect the cargo?" Sabrina asked. "No," Elise replied. "And we were never allowed to see the raw sensor logs. We were simply told that if we did not sign the statements exactly as they were written, we would be severely disciplined for delaying the supply chain. We were forced to validate a process we were entirely blind to." I looked across the table. We had a technology employee testifying to the deliberate destruction of evidence, and a logistics coordinator testifying to the systemic manufacturing of false safety records. It felt like an overwhelming, undeniable victory. I watched Marcus Thorne, expecting the lead litigator to finally concede the position. Instead, Thorne casually straightened his tie, picked up his pen, and executed a masterful, terrifying pivot. "The testimony we have heard today is certainly concerning," Thorne said, his voice dripping with reasonable concern. "It is painfully clear that the internal procedures between human resources, operations, and technical support are chaotic, poorly managed, and highly disorganized. Meridian clearly suffers from a tragic breakdown in interdepartmental communication." He looked directly at Lena Rowe, ensuring the federal investigator heard his next words perfectly. "However, disorganized procedures do not equate to a criminal conspiracy," Thorne argued smoothly. "An overzealous human resources manager sending aggressive emails, or a confused technology supervisor misinterpreting a routine maintenance protocol, simply proves that our middle management needs better training. Ms. James has presented a compelling picture of a messy corporate environment, but she has provided absolutely zero proof of a targeted, malicious plot engineered by anyone in the executive suite. There is no central mastermind here, only a collection of unfortunate, disconnected mistakes." The air left my lungs. The realization hit me with crushing weight. Thorne was not fighting the evidence anymore. He was absorbing it. He was willingly sacrificing the entire middle management tier, painting them as incompetent fools, just to build an impenetrable firewall around the top executives. The hearing adjourned shortly after, leaving a dense, suffocating atmosphere in its wake. I walked out of the boardroom knowing exactly where I stood. I was standing inches away from the absolute truth. I had the forged documents, the altered logs, and the witnesses proving the system was rigged. But Thorne was right about one terrifying detail. I did not have the silver bullet. I did not have the singular, undeniable piece of evidence that directly linked the order to forge those documents to Grant Ellison or Victor Sloan. If I could not find a way to lock the mastermind into the chain of evidence, all of this would simply be classified as a collective administrative error. The company would pay a massive civil fine, human resources would get fired, and the men who actually built the machine would walk away completely untouched. I was right at the finish line, and I was about to lose everything. The suffocating atmosphere of the boardroom following Marcus Thorne's arrogant defense lasted exactly 48 hours. Thorne truly believed he had successfully isolated the executive suite by willingly sacrificing the middle managers. He built a firewall out of their presumed incompetence. However, he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern compliance architecture. Data does not just live in the building. Federal investigator Lena Rowe called for an immediate, mandatory reconvening of the hearing on a Monday morning. This time, she did not sit quietly in the back corner of the room. She walked straight to the head of the massive oak table, carrying a heavy, sealed black briefcase. The corporate litigators watched her with a sudden, sharp unease. "We executed an expanded federal seizure warrant over the weekend," Lena announced, her voice carrying absolute authority. "We did not serve it to your internal technology department. We served it directly to your external some third-party off-site storage provider." I watched the color instantly drain from the face of Chief Executive Officer Grant Ellison. Meridian's executive team had been so hyper-focused on scrubbing their internal network and physically wiping my laptop that they had completely ignored the automated, deep-level redundancy protocols. They had forgotten about the archival snapshots, the system that automatically duplicates every single checksum receipt to an off-site server the moment a monthly ledger is locked. Lena opened the briefcase and distributed a newly printed stack of forensic analyses. When we ran a direct comparison between the external archival snapshots and the localized files human resources used to suspend Ms. James, the narrative of administrative error completely collapsed, Lena stated smoothly. The documents used to frame her were created 3 full days after the official monthly lockdown. The creator simply backdated the timestamps to make them look like original, foundational records. Marcus Thorne opened his mouth to formulate an objection, but Lena cut him off instantly. "Do not bother, Mr. Thorne. The deep metadata is irrefutable. We pulled the digital routing history. The forged documents were constructed on an executive terminal. The terminal was unlocked using a temporary, high-level access key explicitly assigned to Nolan Ellison. Furthermore, the command that authorized the creation of that temporary key was triggered directly from the special administrative account belonging to Tessa Reed." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The firewall was gone. Lena had just forensically chained the forged paperwork directly to the Director of Operations and the Director of Human Resources, but Lena was not finished. She turned her attention to the silent board members, specifically locking eyes with Victor Sloan. Simultaneously, our financial division completed their trace on the phantom contractor known as North Vantage Consulting, Lena continued, dropping a dense financial flowchart onto the table. The funds did not just wash through Delaware shell companies to inflate operational bonuses. We pierced the corporate veil of the final holding company. The entity controlling North Vantage is a private, irrevocable family trust. The primary beneficiary of that trust is the Ellison family. The room seemed to physically tilt. They had not just been falsifying safety records to protect their quarterly shipping volume. They had been actively embezzling millions of dollars from their own corporate treasury, routing the money through a fake vendor directly into their own generational wealth. Victor Sloan, realizing the entire ship was sinking, immediately tried to secure a lifeboat. He slammed his hand against the table, glaring at Grant Ellison. "This is an absolute disgrace," Victor barked, playing the role of the outraged board member perfectly. "Grant, if your nephew and your human resources director were running a rogue financial operation right under your nose, you have catastrophically failed this company. The board will demand immediate resignations from both Nolan and Tessa." It was a desperate, vicious move to amputate the infected limbs and save the core. But my attorney, Sabrina Vale, leaned forward, a predator finally closing its jaws. "You cannot isolate the infection, Mr. Sloan," Sabrina said, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. "Because we also recovered the deleted cold storage emails from the executive server," Sabrina slid a final, highlighted transcript across the table. "This is an encrypted communication chain between Nolan Ellison and Grant Ellison, dated exactly 2 weeks before my client was suspended. In it, Nolan explicitly warns his uncle that the external regulatory audit will fail because of the missing warehouse temperature data. Grant Ellison's direct written reply was, and I quote, "Execute the human resources solution regarding the compliance manager before the audit begins, and ensure the consulting invoices are cleared tonight." The chief executive officer had personally ordered the hit. He had knowingly approved the framing, the forgery, and the embezzlement. The psychological pressure finally shattered the weakest link. Tessa Reed broke. The polished, terrifyingly calm director of human resources buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. She knew she was looking at federal prison time for obstruction of justice. "I will cooperate," Tessa blurted out, her voice cracking, completely abandoning her soft, manipulative tone. "I will sign whatever you need. I was given a direct order by Grant. We were never investigating Harper." The conclusion was written before we even called her into the room. "We were tasked with fabricating a disciplinary file hostile enough to legally force her out of the building before the auditors arrived." Hearing his shield collapse, Nolan Ellison completely lost his temper. He leaped to his feet, his face flushed with furious, arrogant indignation. "You are all acting like I committed a murder," Nolan shouted, pointing an aggressive finger at Lena Rowe. "I was protecting the revenue stream. I was protecting the jobs of every single person in this building. The safety guidelines are completely overly conservative. The product was perfectly fine. I made a judgment call to keep the supply chain moving, and it saved this company millions of dollars in the third quarter." Sabrina looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Thank you. Nolan, you just officially confessed, on the record and in front of a federal investigator, to knowingly overriding critical medical compliance standards for the sake of quarterly financial profit." Nolan froze, the realization of his own catastrophic stupidity washing over him as he slowly sank back into his leather chair. The battle was over. The execution was absolute. By the end of the week, the fallout was apocalyptic. I was fully and publicly exonerated. My temporary suspension was officially expunged from the corporate database, replaced by a permanent, highly detailed federal exoneration decree. Grant Ellison, Nolan Ellison, Tessa Reed, and Victor Sloan were all forcibly removed from their positions, escorted out of the glass lobby by federal agents, facing a mountain of criminal indictments for fraud, embezzlement, and evidence tampering. The entire corrupt architecture they had built collapsed in a spectacular, deeply public humiliation that wiped out massive percentages of their personal net worth. The surviving members of the board of directors, desperate to stabilize the company's plummeting public image, formally requested a meeting with me. They offered me my old job back, complete with a massive, retroactive salary increase and a profound public apology. I sat across from the new interim executive team, looking at their desperate, pleading faces. "I will not accept the position of senior compliance records manager," I told them flatly. Panic flashed across their eyes. They needed me to return to prove to the federal regulators that the company had reformed. "I will, however, accept a newly created position," I continued. "I will return as the independent director of records and compliance. I will possess unilateral, unchallengeable authority to initiate preservation holds on any department. I will have an ironclad, contractually guaranteed budget to protect whistleblowers from internal retaliation. And I will no longer report to the operations department or human resources. I report exclusively and directly to the external audit committee." They did not hesitate for a single second. They drafted the contract right there in the room. The story of my return did not end with a massive celebration or a triumphant speech. It ended quietly, exactly where it began. Late on a Friday evening, I walked down the metal stairs onto the concrete floor of Warehouse 4. The heavy, rhythmic hum of the massive industrial refrigeration units vibrated through my shoes. The ambient temperature was perfectly stabilized. I walked into the glass-walled compliance booth. The space had been deeply cleaned, the old hardware ripped out and replaced. I stood in front of the brand-new, reinforced physical filing cabinets installed against the back wall, I reached out and ran my hand along the cool metal surface of the top drawer. For months, the executives on the highest floors believed that their power, their titles, and their money allowed them to write their own version of the truth. They thought reality was whatever they typed into a computer screen. They were wrong. As I opened the drawer and placed a brand new, empty, hardbound navy blue notebook inside, I understood the absolute power of what I did for a living. They thought they could erase the truth, right up until the exact moment the records I kept forced them to sit down and read exactly what they had done. Thank you all so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support us further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.